Dear church, let's talk about integrity. Hello and welcome to the Dear Church podcast. I'm your host, Chris McCurley. We're going to be talking about integrity today and over the next few weeks. Appreciate you tuning in as we ask various questions related to our integrity. Do you know who this is? This is Don Sutton. And Don Sutton may be the greatest Major League Baseball player that no one has ever heard of. Okay, maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but I don't believe I'm overstating it when I say that Don Sutton's accomplishments have gone relatively unnoticed through the years. Sutton played 21 seasons in the major leagues. However, during that time, he won 20 games only once. And by the way, 20-win seasons are one of the metrics that baseball critics use to define a pitcher's success. Another metric is no-hitters. Don Sutton never had one. In fact, only once did Sutton lead the league in any statistical category. That was in 1980 when he led the National League in earned run average. But on June 18, 1986, the rather ordinary and obscure pitcher rubbed elbows with the elites of baseball when he became a part of the 300-win club. Currently, there are only 24 pitchers in the history of the major leagues who have won 300 games, and Sutton is one of them. Here's what Don Sutton had to say about his career. "I am a grinder," he said, "a mechanic. I never considered myself flamboyant or exceptional, but all my life I found a way to get the job done." And get it done he did. Through 2 decades, 6 presidential terms, 4 trades to other teams, all he did was consistently get the job done. In September of 1986, Inside Sports magazine called him the family sedan of baseball's men on the mound. He wasn't a Porsche or a Ferrari like Sandy Koufax or Nolan Ryan. No, he was more like a Toyota Camry. Not very fancy, just trusty and reliable. The guy that we'll be talking about this morning could be described the same way. Trusty and reliable. He didn't burst onto the scene in a big way. He didn't make a huge splash. Although he is well known, it's not because he slayed a giant or defeated an invading army. No, what makes this person stand out is his integrity. Our working definition of integrity during this series is going to be this: doing the right thing just because it's the right thing to do. I also could define integrity this way: doing what you ought to do, even if it costs you. I want to mention in the beginning of this series, and we'll talk about it as we go throughout, is integrity is personal, but it's not private. There's this thing in the engineering world called structural integrity. Structural integrity refers to a structure's ability to hold together under a load, including its own weight, without breaking due to fracture or fatigue. When the structural integrity of a structure is compromised, the load is transferred to and potentially overloads surrounding support structures. And people are no different. A failure in personal integrity adds stress to those around us. The failure is never isolated. The load is always transferred. Not doing what you ought to do will always cost someone else. We could say it this way: your irresponsibility always becomes someone else's responsibility. As a teenager, I didn't always act responsibly, and it greatly concerned my mother and father. Like most parents who love their children, they were worried about me. My irresponsibility became their responsibility, and that's how integrity works. So it's not just about me. Strong integrity has the potential to strengthen those around me, while weak integrity can burden those around me. Let's turn our attention to a man of incredible integrity. Now, later on in this series, we're going to talk about a guy who traded his future for a bowl of stew. But this morning, I want us to look at another story involving food. This time, the gentleman that we'll be studying made a wise choice. Turn with me to Daniel chapter 1. And before we read, let me set the stage. The time is approximately 605 BC. The king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, is on a winning streak. He's defeated the Egyptians and what was left of the Assyrian army. He then turns his sights toward Judah and invades the capital city of Jerusalem. He takes their king and hauls him back to Babylon because Nebuchadnezzar had this weird obsession with collecting kings. Anytime he conquered a nation, he would take that nation's king captive, put him in prison, and then bring him out at parties to show off just how powerful he was. But a king wasn't the only thing Nebuchadnezzar took with him. Read with me. It says, "Then the king told Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, 4 youths in whom there was no impairment, who were good-looking, suitable for instruction in every kind of expertise, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had ability to serve in the king's court. And he ordained Ashpenaz to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king also allotted for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and ordered that they be educated for 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service." Now, Nebuchadnezzar was a smart guy. Instead of slaughtering everyone when he conquered a nation or a city, he would instead take some souvenirs in the form of the best and brightest of the young people. He would kidnap them, take them to Babylon, change their name, and make them slaves. Now, as you can imagine, this made Babylon a very cosmopolitan place. If you're one of these young men that's been kidnapped and trained to serve in the king's palace, well, you've won the lottery. You're not going to have to do backbreaking labor in the oppressive heat day in and day out. If you're going to be taken into captivity, this is the way to go. And right before you're hauled away, your dad may say something to you like, "Son, don't mess this up. This is as good as it gets. Plus, there's plenty more where you came from." So while Daniel and his family are distraught from being separated and carried into captivity, it could be way worse. Daniel's going to live in the lap of luxury, and part of this luxurious lifestyle is a meal plan. Not only will Daniel be well fed, he'll also be eating the same food that's served to the king. That's quite a deal. Daniel would have his most important needs met, food, shelter, security, as long as he obeyed. Now, Daniel was one of the Fab Four, if you will. You know who the other 3 were? That's right, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The Fab Four stand out as the brightest of the bright and the bestest of the best. And upon arrival in Babylon, the king changes their names. When you name or rename something, it's evidence that you own it. For instance, if you adopt a pet, you may not like the name that it was given at the shelter, so you change its name. You have a right to do that because you now own the pet. So when Nebuchadnezzar changed the names of these teenage boys, it was a statement of ownership. The king is saying, "I own you. You are mine. I am your Lord. I have complete control over your life. Do as I say or else." So Daniel and his friends have it made. You change your name, that's annoying, but that's a rather small price to pay for living in luxury. But this is where the story takes a turn. Let's keep reading in Daniel chapter 1, this time in verse 8. It says, "But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself." Now, as I said, we're going to look at another situation involving food and a person in this series. It's with Jacob and Esau, and we'll talk about how Esau made a really poor decision concerning a bowl of stew. He traded his future for it, and that seems silly. Why would you trade your entire future for a bowl of stew? But some might ask the same thing with Daniel. Really, Daniel? I mean, you've got a pretty good gig here. You're going to potentially throw it all away over food? Seriously? I mean, don't go making some silly decision in the name of religion and risk alienation or death. Just eat it and keep your mouth closed. But notice verse 8 again. "But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank." If you use the English Standard Version, it reads like this: "But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank." The King James renders it this way: "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank." A new home, a new education, and a new name were one thing. But Daniel drew the line with the king's meal plan. Being raised in a Hebrew home under the law of Moses, there were certain foods that God had forbidden. Some of those unclean foods were on the king's menu. To eat this food would mean that Daniel and his friends would have to compromise their loyalty to God. In reviewing the king's edict, Daniel decided that the choice was clear. He just couldn't do it. He couldn't adhere to the king's diet. Many of us, right before we dig in to eat, we'll say this prayer: Lord, please bless this food to the nourishment of our bodies. This prayer points to a chain of events. In the ancient world, the people looked at it this way: God provides the food because He sends the rain and He keeps away the locusts. The food goes into the body, which makes the body healthy, and ultimately the person can then prosper. The issue for Daniel is that the God in this chain was not the one true God, the big G God. No, the God in Nebuchadnezzar's chain was Marduk, the God of the Babylonians. So Marduk provides the food, which makes the body healthy and provides prosperity to the one who eats. Daniel would be admitting that Marduk was greater than his God. And let's face it, there was some evidence to suggest that since Babylon was thriving while God's people were in captivity, maybe that was true. But Daniel had already made up his mind that he wasn't going to play that game. Daniel refused to be evidence. He refused to be evidence that Babylon's God was anything other than a figment of their imagination. This wasn't just about food. It was about something deeper. It was about who ruled Daniel's life. And because the big G God sat on the throne of his heart, there wasn't any room for some made-up little g God. But here's the deal. Daniel didn't make this choice in the moment. This was a decision that he made long before. Daniel made up his mind before there was a story about Daniel, before there was a book that bears his name. Before he knew the story about Daniel, Daniel made up his mind. In fact, the only reason we know this story is because Daniel made up his mind ahead of time. Winter was coming, and a hunter was looking for ways to keep warm. So he went out into the woods in the hopes of shooting a bear and making a warm coat out of its fur. As luck would have it, the hunter spots a bear. As he raises his gun, the bear notices him and says, "Wait, why do you want to shoot me?" And the hunter replied, "Well, because I'm cold." "Well, I'm hungry," said the bear. "Maybe we can reach an agreement." And they did. The bear ate the hunter, which meant that he was no longer hungry, and the hunter was no longer cold. Compromise can be good in some matters, but not when it comes to our spirituality. There are some things that just can't be bartered, and loyalty to God is one of them. Daniel held an airtight conviction that there was no settlement to be reached between his God and Babylon's God. This was an area of non-compliance. End of story. In fact, there would be no story if Daniel had compromised on the food. No lion's den, no interpreting of the king's dreams, no rising to prominence in the king's palace, nor being used by God to tell his story. If Daniel had not made up his mind ahead of time and drawn the line in the sand early, he would have forfeited the opportunity to write a story worth reading. Because, please hear me on this, when you do what you ought to do, even if it costs you, you write a story worth reading and a story worth remembering. A breach in integrity tells a story, but not one worth remembering. And a breach in integrity usually leads to another. Have you noticed that? Maybe in your own life or by observation? A breach in integrity will typically lead to a second breach in integrity. And each breach becomes easier. The second breach will almost always lead to a pattern. Once you compromise once, it becomes easier to compromise twice and a third time and a fourth and so on. Each breach makes it easier to settle for less than what God expects. When we sacrifice our integrity, we close the book. You never know the story that could have been told. God can tell His story with or without you. He can even use your lack of integrity to tell a powerful story. But wouldn't you rather be the hero? When the Civil War began, there was a gentleman that didn't want to fight. He didn't want to pick a side, so he wore a gray jacket representing the Confederates and blue pants for the Union Army. And guess what? He got shot at by both sides. Some things require an all or nothing commitment. And Daniel understood this, so he made up his mind early. He made up his mind before his city was under siege, before being carried away to Babylon, before becoming the property of a foreign king. He made up his mind ahead of time what he wanted to be, and what he wanted to be was a man who served the one true God no matter what. He made up his mind knowing full well that it might limit his time. Daniel didn't know how this story would turn out. His only hope was that God would intervene, but God hadn't promised to intervene. There was no guarantee that God would step in and protect Daniel. Integrity is doing the right thing even if it costs you, and there is no guarantee that it won't cost you. However, no matter the cost, it's always worth the risk. It is always in our best interest to place our lives in God's hands and let Him do what He intends. I want you to notice something else about Daniel's integrity here. Continue reading with me in verse 9 and following. It says, "Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. The commander of the officials said to Daniel, 'I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has allotted your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces looking gaunt in comparison to the youths who are your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king.' But Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, 'Please put your servants to the test for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined in your presence, and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see.'" I want you to notice how Daniel handled the situation. After resolving to not defile himself with the king's choice food, he didn't go on a hunger strike or protest in radical fashion. Instead, he sought out the commander of the officials and respectfully shared his dilemma with him. And the commander, of course, feared for his own life. His neck was on the line. What if these young men were to become malnourished and sickly because they refused to eat? It would be assumed that he didn't carry out his duties, and thus it would be off with his head. But Daniel had full confidence in his 10-day miracle diet. Actually, he had full confidence in his God. Even though God had not promised to intervene, Daniel was confident that the story would play out in his favor so long as it was God's story. It's when we try to write our own story that things get unreadable. Primarily, there are 3 reactions when our faith is put to the test. We either separate, assimilate, or exacerbate. Now, separation is a method that has been employed throughout the centuries. Nuns living in convents, monks living in monastic societies, hermits living in solitude. The idea is, I need to remove myself from the world so as not to be stained by the world. Some modern-day Christians separate by only listening to Christian music, only reading Christian books, only watching Christian movies, attending Christian schools. And we need to practice separation at times. Protecting your soul and the soul of your family will require separation from certain worldly things. However, we cannot practice Christianity in a bubble or isolated from the rest of society all the time. At some point, we must go out into the world. And throughout the centuries, certain religious movements have zeroed in on isolation in an effort to keep oneself unstained from the world. Again, nuns living in convents, monks living in monasteries, hermits living in solitude. Some of our modern-day churches even have become places of separation and isolation where Christians gather but rarely ever scatter and share their faith. They're more inward-focused rather than outward-focused. Separation can be a good thing. It can be a necessary thing. Like Daniel, we've got to draw some lines in the sand, but separation can also hinder the work of the church. If we don't go, who will? Now, the opposite of this is assimilation. This is chameleon Christianity. Get in where you fit in. Camouflage your faith so that you blend in with the rest of the world. Some choose this method because it's easier than standing up and standing out. Who wants to be a religious weirdo or some Jesus freak? Better to go along with the crowd than stick out like a sore thumb. Daniel could have done this. It would have been much easier to justify his predicament by telling himself, look, God understands. It's just food. Here's the thing. Assimilation is easy. It doesn't require any conviction, but it also compromises integrity. And then there's exacerbation. You know what it means to exacerbate a situation? It means to make a bad situation worse. And sometimes we're so full of conviction that we spew aggression. We want to beat the truth into a person. The Bible is our sword, a sword that we use to cut down anyone who disagrees with us. And rather than preaching the truth in love, we breach our integrity with hate. But I love how Daniel handles the situation. He's resourceful and respectful. He handles a difficult situation, not with gall, but with grace. What do you want to be? How about being a Daniel? That's why his story is included in the Bible. That is absolutely why God used this man to tell his story, because he wanted us to read about him with a mind to be like him. Daniel isn't meant to be admired. He's not meant to be applauded. He's meant to be modeled. He's meant to be imitated. Look with me at verse 21 of chapter 1. And Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. Now that may seem inconsequential, but it's not. Do you know how long it was from the time Daniel made up his mind about not eating the food and the first year of King Cyrus? Approximately 70 years. For 70 years, Daniel has the king's ear. Nebuchadnezzar, Darius, and now Cyrus. Daniel was with them all. God has strategically placed him in the palace to be a man of influence to the three most powerful men alive. And guess what set him up for this? That's right. The decision he made as a teenager, way back in the day. There would be other decisions throughout his life in which he would refuse to compromise his faith and breach his integrity, but those decisions get easier and easier when you've made up your mind ahead of time. Let's jump ahead in Daniel's story. Look at chapter 6, starting in verse 3. It says, Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king intended to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel regarding government affairs. But they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption because he was trustworthy and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Then these men said, We will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him regarding the law of his God. Real quick, here's the setting. Over 50 years have passed since being taken into captivity. The Persians have replaced the Babylonians. The new king Darius decides to reshuffle the empire, and he appoints 120 governors and 3 administrators to oversee the 120 governors, and he just goes and plays golf. And when you know it, Daniel is chosen as one of the 3 governors who will oversee the other governors and essentially run the day-to-day duties of the empire. But not only that, notice again what it says in verse 3. The king intended to appoint him over the entire kingdom. He's not even from there. He's in his 70s. Daniel had proven himself, and the king had full faith and trust in this man of integrity. Well, this didn't set well with the rest of the officials. They were jealous, so they tried to find some dirt on Daniel, and guess what? They couldn't find any. They couldn't find any regarding government affairs. Daniel had been in government for 50 years. Surely there was some impropriety somewhere. No one can remain in government that long and still be as pure as the driven snow. Plus, you have the higher-ups looking for dirt. Surely they're going to find something. No, they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption because he was trustworthy and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. That, my friends, is something to aspire to. That's the goal. The other officials reached the conclusion that the only way they can get to Daniel is by going after his faith. And look at it again. Then these men said, We will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him regarding the law of his God. Daniel's enemies recognized that he was a man of integrity, and they could only see that his integrity was connected to the God he served. So the only option that they had was to get between him and his God. And you can read further in the story and see how that didn't work either. What do you want to be? Have you made up your mind? Decide now. Daniel was a man of integrity at 70 because he made up his mind around 17. Most people make up their mind at the time, in the moment. Many don't like to make up their mind ahead of time because it locks them in. Deciding ahead of time to do the right thing, even if it costs you, will limit you. If you make integrity your guide ahead of time, you're going to miss out on some things. However, those of you who are older can attest to this. If you made up your mind at 17, you would have missed out on some things, but you wouldn't have had the regrets that you have today, right? If I made up my mind at 17, I would have missed out on some things that wouldn't still be haunting me today. And I think virtually all of us can admit that we wished we would have made up our minds sooner rather than later. You know, the movie To End All Wars is the true story of a group of Allied prisoners in a Japanese labor camp during World War II. And there's a scene in the movie where the prisoners are discussing what they will do when the war is over. And one soldier says that he's going to get married. Another plans to be a teacher. But when they ask the colonel what he will do, he simply replies, I'll start preparing for the next war. And that's kind of how things are for us as Christians. We're constantly preparing for the next battle because Satan hasn't surrendered. However, Each battle is much easier to fight when you make up your mind ahead of time to let integrity be your guide. What do you want to be? Have you made up your mind? Thank you for tuning in to the Dear Church podcast. If you have a question about this episode or any installment in the podcast, please feel free to email me at chris.mccurley@rippleoflight.com, and we'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you so much for tuning in. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Sincerely, Chris.